Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. This is Derek. I'm thrilled for today's conversation. I think you're going to very much appreciate my guest. His name is Leyf Treinin. Max is a certified Rolfer, R-O-L-F-E-R, for the uninitiated. He's a philosopher and an anthroposopher who resides in Alaska. He earned his doctorate in philosophy from the California Institute of Integral Studies. He teaches ethics, epistemology, philosophy of science, and introduction to philosophy in Anchorage, Alaska, where he also maintains a Rolfing practice called The Way of the Elbow. His website can be found at theoriapress.substack.com, theoriapress.substack.com. He co-wrote What Barfield Thought with another guest in this series, Landon Loftin. Most of all, has an incredible capacity to be generous, thoughtful, prudent, wise, and kind. Exact type of person that you would hope to have as a college professor, as a friend, and as a colleague. I'm grateful that you've joined us for this episode, and I'm thankful to Max for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. Well, Max, it's so good to have you with me here today as we talk about Owen Barfield. And I was curious if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your backstory. Kind of how did you end up in Anchorage as if I understand it, you're a certified Rolfer, which you'll have to explain to me, but also a professor of philosophy.
Sure thing, and thanks, Derek. I appreciate you having me on, and I'm looking forward to this conversation and to diving in to some of these subjects. Yeah, that's right. I'm calling in from Alaska. I was born here 36 and a half years ago. So for me, it was actually like a there and back again story, so to speak. I moved away for good at least one time, but I came back here, and it's actually kind of an interesting story. Like I moved away to do my graduate studies in San Francisco. And when it comes down to it, I was really looking for a community of people that were more interested in things like the very subject matter we're going to be discussing today, like Owen Barfield. And I really just didn't feel that I found that in Alaska. So I went and searched for it. And to a large extent, I found exactly what I was looking for. But that was also, I think this is pretty common for everyone, like that late 20s, early 30s. It's a transitional period in a person's life. So I was about 27 when I made this decision that, so again, I went in search of something, and it's not that I didn't find it, but rather what I was looking for actually changed at that time in my life. And I realized I really cared much less about having a community of like-minded individuals, and especially in this time that we're living, it just feels much less urgent because, for instance, you and I can connect, and you and I, again, are comparatively close on the surface of this globe. But even that's thousands of miles that separates us, but it doesn't prevent us from having a kind of discussion like this. So that was part of what accounted for my change in my decision. But also, I think it is, at least for me, it felt like a natural progression into a new season of my life. And what I was really looking for, first I was looking for the like-minded community. But then I had a reshuffling of my priorities, and I really started to look for a place where I could in some way, like, contribute or give back in a meaningful way to the community. And I thought, suddenly when your criteria change, your whole evaluation is liable to change as a result. And I realized, like, it's actually a good thing if I'm living in a place where not everyone is like me, because you have much more to offer to the community. And so I made that decision again. And I never looked back. It was definitely the right thing for me to move back here. And I've been able to do it. A lot of people, especially in Alaska, I think there's a pressure that people feel. I certainly felt this in like when I was younger in high school, college. There's sort of pressure to move out and make your way in the world somewhere in like a bigger city. But I really felt that, at least for myself, I've really outgrown that. What I would really like to do is just contribute in a positive way to people around me here in this community.
That's interesting. I was going to say, I think, perhaps, see what you think of this, in our early years, that first foray, as you mentioned, going to San Francisco, et cetera. I think part of that search is for our own identity, that we seek that sort of camaraderie among like-minded folks. And maybe once that's cemented, we have the conviction and courage to be ourselves in a more diverse surrounding.
I think that's very well said. The only thing I would hesitate to entirely affirm is that your identity is something that you stumble upon. I
Uh,
really think it's something that you fashion through those kind of experiences. And I also don't think it's something that you just arrive at once and for all. I do think it's
that's,
something that you
yes, I
continually
agree.
fashion.
Yeah.
I love this quote from Aristotle. It's, well, he's quoting Solon, I think, but he says, call no man happy until he's dead. Call no man happy until he's dead. But the way I interpret that from Aristotle, especially, is because, well, of course, the same phrase will mean different things depending on who says it. When Aristotle says it, the reason he says that is because happiness, or eudaimonia, in Aristotle's conception of ethics and the human life, it's something that you can't resolve at an instant. It has a periodicity, and that periodicity is nothing less than the whole human life. So it's always too early to submit a final verdict on whether a person is living well. You have to take it as a whole. You know, you have to take the life as it comes, and the period that has to elapse is the whole lifetime. And so I think there's a sort of musical quality to it almost, in the sense that you have to take a piece of music as a whole, and you can't just, you know, arbitrarily pick out this part or that part. The whole thing, I mean, it has a body not just in space but in time. With music, and I really feel life has that quality to it. And so I think at each time, I mean, this is kind of self-evident. I'm saying something that's really obvious. The way to live well as a small child, as a 6-year-old, is different than the way to live as a 36-year-old or a 46-year-old. And if you try to, you know, put new wine into old wineskins or something, try to live in the same way later in life that you were earlier, even if you're succeeding earlier, there's no guarantee you're going to succeed later with the same approach. Like, you have to be attentive to that kind of development and evolution through life. So that's what I tried to be. I think that was really, I was trying to be attuned to that at that point in my life, and I realized I need something different now, which happened to be just where I came from.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And so a couple of follow-up questions. You're currently a professor. What domain do you inhabit in that regard?
That's philosophy, and as a rule, I'm teaching entry-level classes. That's ethics and critical thinking are the staples, and then from time to time I teach epistemology and philosophy of science. And I'm doing that. Last year I had an arrangement where I was able to sort of step into the faculty as a visiting professor, and that was a promotion for me in a way, because as a rule for the last, I guess it's been 8 years now, 8 years, I've been working as an adjunct. So that's just like waiting on the crumbs from the table, waiting for the crumbs to fall. And
it's very difficult.
yeah, you know, it is what it is. It's funny, one of my students, she told me that she wanted to change her major from psychology to philosophy. She wanted to have a meeting with me. This was earlier in the fall. And she announced that she wanted to change her major to philosophy and that she thought she wanted to be a teacher. And I think she was expecting like this full-throated endorsement from me, and that's not what she got. It's not because I don't think she could do a great job, but I really said, like, you know, this thing that you're looking for first and not finding in psychology, you're probably not going to find it in philosophy either. It's something that, in a way, like, you have to bring it to the table, or you have to find. I told her, like, don't select your classes based on the subject matter, because the subject matter it belies what's really going to happen in that class. It's deceptive, and that's a lesson that I learned from my own experience. And I said, choose your courses on the basis of the professors that you feel you can, I even hesitate to say learn something from the professors that can speak to this part of you that you want to develop. And then I said about teaching, I was like, you know, it was the right decision for me, but don't do it unless you have any other choice. And for me, it is kind of an interesting story. The reason I went back into teaching, I finished my Rolfing certification after college, and as far as I was concerned, if somebody asked me at that point, it's like, this is my career. I enjoyed my time in academia, but I finished with it. I've like closed the book, turned the page. But it was actually kind of spontaneously, I attended the retirement party of a former professor I had, professor of literature. And I was so moved sitting in the audience there, you know, surrounded by countless other students, former students like me. I was so moved by this feeling of gratitude that I had to him for the again, it's not even just imparting knowledge to me, it's more opening my eyes and my heart to a new way of seeing, experiencing the world. And I was so grateful, and it dawned on me at that moment, it was so transparently clear, like, there's no way I can repay this person for the gift he's given me. But that's a feature, it's like a feature of life's structure or life's geometry, which is that the greatest gifts, the most important, the highest things, you can never repay them to the person, because they don't really come from people. They don't originate with people. They come through people. And so it was so abundantly clear at that moment. It's like, the structure of life is that you never pay it back to the one you received it from. You pay it forward to the next generation. I just thought at that moment it dawned on me. It's like it was almost like a karmic or a dharmic realization. I thought like I need to begin today to prepare so that if somebody like me comes around in 5 and 10, 20 years, that I will have prepared so that I can serve the same role that this Dr. Nunnally served in my own development. And from that point, then it was just a question. It had already been decided, and it was just a question of making it happen. And so that's so then I went matriculated to graduate school in California, and just there's a metaphor from Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha about like if you drop a rock into a pool, it will always find the straightest trajectory to the bottom. And I kind of felt like that once I showed up for my master's and PhD. It's like I had a mission, and I was just going to get to the goal at any cost, because I really felt that this is what my life needs to include is this giving back the gift that I received. So, and since then, it's made it easier to endure all the kind of nonsense around the hiring policies and adjunct life. I split my time between 2 universities here. Again, just like trying to gather up the crumbs that fall from the tables at the respective campuses.
Yeah. Wow. It was very inspiring. Like you, I've taught for many years, and at this stage in my journey, I feel as though the great teachers love the students just a little more than the subject, and it remains sort of this a passion for the content, of course, because you're so inspired by the thoughts and ideas and the potential outcomes of their application or their embodiment. And yet it is, as you say, that almost alchemical mix that is a little indefinable that occurs in a learning environment with freedom and courage, but also always bounded by love for the person in front of you.
No, I really like that you brought that in to the question, because a lot of people think so abstractly, as though you could just teach out into the ether or something. But that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that you could like cut something with a knife unless there was something there that was being cut at the same time. So in the same way, not to necessarily compare teaching to cutting, but it's like those are 2 things that happen at the same time and to the same extent, the teaching and the learning. Mm-hmm. You can't separate one from the other. And it requires the entire context that you described. And I think that's just right. I had such a formative experience. I was kind of nervous. This was my very first class. I never taught. And up here, maybe it's different in other schools, but it's basically just like they just throw you in the water and see if you're going to,
Yeah. I
had no preparation. I just showed up the first, I knew what time the class was. But I ran into a former professor of mine. And he said, and this was on the way. I was walking to my very first class, in the end of August. He said, "Oh, I heard that you're teaching here. Like, that's great." And he said, "But be prepared to be disappointed with the students. Like, they're so lazy and distracted, and they're always on their phones or their computers, and they're just the worst. And, since your time, even like, 5, 10, probably 10 years later at that point, 7 years later anyway, the caliber of the student has noticeably declined, and the world's going to the dogs," basically, he said. And I remember being so shaken up and, kind of thinking like, being a little bit apprehensive about like, well, who am I going to find in this classroom? But then also feeling like, if you really have so much contempt for your students, what in the world are you doing here? Like, go find a new job. It's so crazy. Right. But I love the way you said it too, because I've felt that both jobs that I have, I really pay the bills through Rolfing and then teaching as a labor of love. Not that Rolfing is different, but both of them actually, they challenge me and they require me. So challenge me is a challenge I embrace though. You can't do that you can't teach well. You can't do Rolfing well unless you like the person that you're trying to help. You have to so it's always challenging you to learn to see the good in people, and then liking them or loving them is the natural response.
So good. Thank you. I'd love to, just before we jump into Rudolf Steiner, which I think is fascinating, but maybe just if you could tell me, your website is Way of the Elbow. I'm curious about what that means, but also I definitely want to hear more about what is Rolfing and how does that assist people in becoming their full selves, or what exactly is the intent there? Yeah,
those are great questions. I'll answer the first part of the question because I think it's much easier. This was me, 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago. And I was just, at that point, I was really on a kick of Eastern philosophy. So I was reading, particularly in this case, the relevant text is the Tao Te Ching. And as many people probably know, the Tao is often translated as way.
Yeah.
And so I thought, I'll call it the Tao of the elbow. So the second part, I should address the second part. Elbow, it's because Rolfing, it has this largely caricatured representation or impression of being quite aggressive. So it's like, deep body work. Sometimes you meet people and they've heard, it has this reputation, I guess, that some people, many people actually seek it out precisely on that basis, whereas other people are repelled by it. And I thought, I'm just going to not beat around the bush and just embrace and so I call it the way of the elbow, kind of as playing into the stereotype reputation that it has. So I originally thought the Tao of the elbow. And Tao, of course, it's way, but way with a capital W, entailing an entire approach to existence. But I mean, that was obviously not going to be a good choice. It's too academic and esoteric. So I quote compromised and called it the way of the elbow. But everyone around me said do not call it that. That's a huge mistake. Come up with any other name other than that. But this is so typical, especially of me at that age. I had already made up my mind, nothing was going to change it. So the name has stuck, and I'm making a living, so it couldn't have been the worst decision.
Yeah. So I admit, never heard of Rolfing before I was put in contact with you through our mutual friend Nate Heil, and so I looked up a couple of clips that you have on YouTube, but those seem to be more posture and body movement. So I'm just curious, maybe just 2 minutes, what is Rolfing?
Yeah, totally. It's funny, I had a teacher one time, he was a high school teacher, but he was a Cold War expert and scholar. And he considered himself a real expert and scholar about the Cold War. And he tells this anecdote though, he's like, one time this magazine contacted me to produce a 500-word article about the Cold War. It's 500 words. I could produce 500 pages. I could produce 5,000 pages about the Cold War. And he says he never submitted an article because he couldn't compress it down into 500 words. And I feel a little bit like that, trying to describe what Rolfing is. Probably the best way to go about it, though, is by way of analogy. You think about what education is doing. This harkens back to the tradition of Plato. There's and we talk about the liberal arts, implying that education has something to do with freedom and liberation. Again, the tradition harkens back to Plato and the iconic image of the allegory of the cave. Education is freeing us from something. It's freeing us from our own fixed ideas, our conceits of knowledge. And so if you think about that in the mind or the soul, and then just analogize that to what happened, the way we go through life in our bodies, we have all kinds of, holding patterns, hang-ups, inhibitions that prevent us from moving through life in a harmonious way, in the body. And again, in exactly the same way that we have the same analogous problems with the mind or the psyche. And so Rolfing, it's much more that's the foremost principle of Rolfing. And then you try to apply the techniques that are at your disposal to arrive at that outcome. So in the one sense, the videos you talked about, they're more postural. But in another sense, the dichotomy is false. And it's a question of attaining the aim or the end. And you're employing what means are at your disposal. So this is kind of interesting, but it's like a bridge between the philosophy or teaching and Rolfing. Is I realized right away in my early 20s when I was probably 21 or 22 when I was just embarking on the Rolfing training, and there was a comprehensive anatomy examination at the end of the first class. It was pass or fail, and you either went on to go and take the second unit of the Rolfing training, or you didn't pass, you didn't get to go on, you had to retake the first class or just find another career path. And I remember all my classmates were really apprehensive about it. But I remember having this thought to myself, there's a distinct hierarchy and triage of important things, and anatomy is actually not on the top of the list. And what's so much more important are things that you wouldn't initially think of. But I just realized already at the beginning, back then, again, as I already mentioned, I was really up to my elbows in Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism. And so for a long time I had thought what a great idea it was to have a meditation practice. But I just realized it was so immediately apparent to me when I started doing that kind of work that I always come up with some excuse not to actually have a practice. I would learn all about it, but never actually do the thing. But it was when I began Rolfing, I realized like you have to do this or else you're being irresponsible to your clients, because you have to be able to show up in a way that's composed, that's present. You have to be attentive. You have to pay attention to what's going on. You have to not be missing things all the time because you're lost in your own thoughts. That was the first thing that kind of surprised me, but it was like a immediate perception of this immediate fact about Rolfing. The other thing that kind of surprised me is how important it was to be able to communicate eloquently. And I felt so deficient in it. I would always reach into my pockets for some kind of metaphor or comparison or simile or whatever I was trying, and come up empty-handed. And it was so annoying. And I just felt so inept in that situation. But I just realized, like, you have to get better at this. So I really, I stopped trying to learn all these foreign languages. I used to try to learn all the foreign languages. And then I just gave it all up. Now I dedicated myself to trying to learn English well. And that was, again, directly the result of just recognizing how important it was in the Rolfing practice. So it sounds funny to think like, oh, well, you would be doing Rolfing with language or with metaphors. But it's not that funny because, again, the point is the principle. You're trying to help a person, become embodied in a certain way that's harmonious, that's free. So it's not at all crazy to think about how words are affecting a person or helping a person free himself from, mental constraints or mental shackles or what. So it's just extension of the same principle into the body. And if you can, I swear, if you can express something in just the right way for the right person, and it's going to be different for each person, everyone hears things different. But if you can hit upon that perfect golden phrase for somebody, you can perform more with one statement than you could with a whole hour's worth of body work. So it's really extraordinary.
Yeah, I have to agree wholeheartedly. I hesitate to use the word precision with language because it makes it seem mechanical, and it's far deeper than that. But there is something to the ability to properly enunciate and articulate either the guidance you're giving or the practice you're helping, as a athlete yourself, when you're coaching, very similar things when you're working with players. In my case, it was basketball, right? That there's just subtle adjustments can make all the difference between reaching their potential or falling far short.
That's very well said, and I appreciate your reservation around the word precision. It almost reminds me, as you were talking, I almost thought of the way it's like, if you want to hit some pitch, you can be sharp or you can be flat, but the best is to, hit that pitch with precision. And it's kind of the same way with the simile. There's a certain musical quality to it.
Yeah, very lyrical. Well, I would love to jump into Rudolf Steiner, and when we first corresponded, as anyone that is participating in this series knows, we're attempting to do a cursory yet comprehensive overview of the life and work of Owen Barfield, known as the first and last Inkling. And you can't explore Barfield very far without encountering Rudolf Steiner.
It doesn't stop some people from trying, but I agree with you. I think you're right.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm a novice in both regards. I've read just very minimal relative to the folks that are appearing on this series, which is why I'm listening to them instead of me talking. So you encountered Barfield through Steiner first. Could you tell me about how that happened?
Yeah, well, and then I would also emphasize just what an unorthodox approach that is for most people. If they encounter, most English speakers, I should say, if they encounter Rudolf Steiner, it would have been through Barfield for many people. Some people they really don't want to touch Steiner with a 10-foot pole, and that's understandable to me, and I'm not going to, if somebody's looking for an argument about it from me, they're not going to find that. I really feel I try to introduce people to Steiner and let them make their own evaluations, because I guess it's not for, Steiner's not for everybody, and I don't know I don't pretend to understand why that is exactly. But Steiner, there was a film that was produced interviewing people around Steiner. It was called The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner. And I love the double entendre about the meaning, at least double, in the sense that Rudolf Steiner is kind of presenting people with a challenge, but he's also, his teaching presents people with a challenge in the sense that you have to be willing to set aside a lot of your fixed thought forms and your fixed ideas to enter. But it's not so different with Barfield. And I think anyone who just has an even cursory encounter with Barfield will see that he hasn't entered the mainstream the way that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien have, and there's a reason for that, and it's not only because he wasn't as prolific, but it's also because he's presenting these theories that really demand not just thinking about new things or different things, but really thinking differently about the same things in some ways. And that's a much taller order. what Barfield does to, a small amount or a certain magnitude, Steiner does to order of magnitude more than that. And so it's not a surprise that it really repels people. I had an interesting, though, encounter with Steiner, and it was kind of fortuitous. This is, again, harkening back into my early to mid-20s. I was enthralled with Eastern philosophy, Buddhism. But by a certain point, around 25, I was probably 25, I realized, I recognized that it was having an adverse effect on my psychology. And because so many of the teachings around detachment and desirelessness, I don't want to speak for other people, but so I'll just speak personally, anecdotally about myself. It was having an effect that I didn't want, and that was a sort of apathy where I stopped caring about things and stopped wanting things. But I wanted to want things. It was like I really felt that I don't know where these kind of convictions come from, but I felt like this is in fact not the path for me in this life. And it was right when I was starting to have that realization that Steiner came into my life again, like very, very fortuitously. And it was, of all things, back in those days, I used to work a few days a week at a chiropractor's office here as a Rolfer. And one of my clients, of all people, we were just chatting, and she kind of out of the blue, she was like, she mentioned, well, her children were in Waldorf school. I later learned that. She mentioned like, oh, have you ever read the works of Rudolf Steiner? I think you would really like them. She said something like that. And I said, well, I know who that is, but I haven't found anything special interest in him. And she said, her response was like extremely enigmatic. She looked at me and she said, give it another chance, would you? And then she said, Anne, just remember, even if you don't understand, it's still working on you.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
But I was immediately intrigued. So that very night when I got home, I just searched the internet, and this was not that long ago, so there was access to all kinds of media. And I found, he still does these recordings, Dale Brunswald had recorded, at that point he had recorded probably dozens of different Steiner books and lectures, and he had recorded, the first one I just stumbled on was a lecture cycle on the Gospel according to John. Wow. And I had, for different reasons, I really didn't have a relationship with Christianity other than to think of it as primitive superstition or something like, what kind of things people say. But I just thought, I'm just going to give this a try. And I was totally riveted. And it was like simultaneous recognition that something's being said here, and something of real substance. It's not just like, stream of consciousness drivel. It's something that's really being said. So that's the one side. And at the same time, it was so simultaneous recognition of that fact, and also the fact that I was not adequate to understand what was being said. Like, something was being said and I couldn't understand it. But it challenged me then to think, like, what do I need to do? How do I need to come to the point where I can understand this? And that was then a process that ensued over the years to follow. And when I was, then it was a couple years later that I had that encounter with my former professor at his retirement party, and ultimately led me to seek to matriculate in some graduate school. And one of my criteria at that point for selecting a graduate school was that it has to be I really want to be able to study Steiner in an academic context. And that really left only one single option, so the choice was kind of self-evident. And this was at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. You may even, it's likely that, at least one of your other guests in the series will have some relationship to that college. But I still remember the interview. He was the chair of the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness department, and he called and he said, like, what makes you think that California Institute of Integral Studies is the right place for you? And I said, well, a couple of reasons, but when it comes down to it, I don't really know, and I can't know until I've gone to school there. And I said, but what do you think? Like, do you think it's the right place for me? And he said, oh, definitely. I said, well, can you say a little bit more? And he was like, well, because California Institute of Integral Studies is like Waldorf school for adults. So
very cool.
I was pretty sold then. His statement, to some extent, bore itself out. I don't know. I don't want to get too much into my experience at California Institute of Integral Studies, but I really appreciated that statement from him, and I got to study exactly what I wanted to.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious, a follow-up on that, if you have any insight to share. Again, probably the vast majority of people coming across this may not be familiar with Waldorf school, maybe by name only. Are there any distinctives about that experience in education that you would share?
Well, only that at that point I was like knee-deep in Steiner, and I had this sense of regret that my parents didn't put me in a Waldorf school. For any listeners who aren't familiar with Waldorf school, in Europe it's called Steiner school. So Steiner is one of the unusual philosophers who who is probably better known by his cultural and practical initiatives than by his name and his work, among those being Waldorf School, the Waldorf School curriculum. He also pioneered certain approaches to agriculture. It's like organic squared. It's kind of a cliched way or trite way to say it, but it's like farming in a way that you are seeking attunement with all the rhythms of nature. He also made not insignificant contributions to theory of painting, theory of art, theory of drama, speech. So Steiner is really a sui generis individual. I should just say, just to recapitulate though, it's many people kind of joke that Barfield can serve as a gateway drug to Steiner. But for me it was the reverse, and for me I just took the plunge from the beginning and then worked my way back to Barfield, and of course then was really delighted to discover who I really feel is a kindred spirit. I read Barfield and I feel a special affinity to him because he and I share the view that Steiner is this really unique individual, and I think it's not difficult to see why he's not better known and why many people are repelled from his teaching. That's not hard to see, but it doesn't change the fact that both myself and also Barfield recognize this really unique contribution that he made.
That's fun. I have the same experience with George MacDonald.
I just finished Fantastes.
Oh, wonderful!
Fantastes.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it. I didn't know what to expect. You just kind of dive in. It's like diving into this dream that keeps proliferating, one thing and the next thing.
Yeah, he and I have the same relationship, perhaps that I guess it would be akin to, for me, C.S. Lewis is to MacDonald as Barfield is to Steiner.
He had written the introduction to the MacDonald text. It's an introduction by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Oh, that's fun.
Can I ask you, what do you teach?
Oh, I've not taught for a couple of years, but I have taught everything ranging from basic theology to more business. I'm a former attorney as well, so I taught things like nonprofit law, business formation, anything having to do with corporate law structure, as well as some American government, since those are all kind of interconnected. Yeah, that's mostly what I've done. I started as a second grade teacher, actually, in California, and then went to grad school, law school, and yeah, go ahead.
Well, I've wondered about the content, like when you say teacher is said in many ways, and I've wondered how continuous it is. I've only taught college, but but my little brother teaches first graders.
Okay.
And I've really had the impression that it's called by the same name, but you have such different motives and aims. Like for second graders, so much of our first graders, second grade, so much of it has to do with almost teaching the kid, helping the kids become socialized, so they can form relationships among their peers. Whereas in college, you have to sort of assume that as a departure point, and there's really material that you have to cover. Whereas I can't think that the academic content of first and second grade curriculum is of paramount importance. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but
yeah, I would not wholeheartedly agree, because I think so much of it is foundational to how they make their way in the structure of civilization. So the basics of your arithmetic and your literacy form a sort of that bridge into polite society, into endeavor, enterprise, contributing. So I do think it's not as robust, but it is certainly as critical as whatever you're covering with your graduate students or undergraduate students. I've had the benefit of teaching every stage, from elementary students, middle school, high school, as well as undergraduate and then graduate students in the law program. And I really meant what I said. I mean, that phrase where I say that the best teachers love the students just a little more than the subject has kind of become my slogan, after nearly 30 years as a teacher, as well as a coach, again, in basketball, probably 15 years of that over the years. And I find that there has to be the underlying passion for whatever the topic is that I'm driving, because I'm genuinely curious, but also that I've got to maintain, as you said, that affection for that human miracle that's in front of me in that moment. And to be attentive to that is essential. And furthermore, I think, and the last point I'll make on this with respect to teaching is, as you've discovered, I'm sure in your time, you'll hear things back from students, not often. I used to joke with other faculty that Jesus healed 10 lepers and only one said thanks. So don't expect to have a bunch of flowery thank you cards at the end of the semester. But I'll hear back from students, 5 years later, run into them or get a little message, and I have no recollection of what they are recounting to me. But as you said, that rightly phrased expression has carried them forward forever. And I have notes from my high school counselor that are still in my briefcase that I'll pull out that have a phrase or an expression that just resonated so deeply with me. It helped cement my courage in life. So anyway, that was a little bit of an aside.
No, I appreciate it. You never know what effect or what significance your actions or your words are having on another person's life. You never know. So it's an admonition to I don't know, try to comport yourself in a certain way, because you never know the effects that it's going to have.
I think it reinforces what you're describing with Rolfing, that attentiveness, that being present, and how mindful and difficult it is in our current culture of incessant interruption. So here's to doing our best to be a part of the solution.
Yeah, right. And it's funny as though there's something else that we would rather be doing than just what you said.
Right. Yeah. Could you maybe summarize for us? I know that's a Herculean effort, but just a little bit about, as you've mentioned, some of Steiner's contributions. What would be critical or monumental things that he has brought to light, and where would people go if they wanted to explore Steiner?
He started off his career as a philosopher, and particularly he served as the editor for Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's scientific writings. And to this day, Steiner's work on Goethe's scientific writings, they're so fresh and extraordinary to read. I'll come back to that in a minute. But that was his beginning, was in philosophy. Over his career, he later branched out into topics like theology, Christology, and then I've mentioned this though, but many cultural initiatives, including the Waldorf school curriculum, biodynamic agriculture, art criticism. He was active as an art critic in his early career. Also, he himself collaborated with another sculptor to produce this really remarkable sculpture. It's called the Representative of Humanity, and it shows, and it's massive. It's probably, I don't know, 20 or 30 feet tall. It's sculpted out of wood, and it's like a symbolic depiction of basically part of Steiner's, I don't know what to call it, theology or cosmology or something, is that Christ represents this sort of, well, many listeners will probably be familiar with Aristotle's theories of ethics, and particularly his idea of the golden mean. So many people, like a lot of people, are wont to think in terms of dichotomies. The stock example, the first one that Aristotle gives, and then Nicomachean in Ethics, is that many people think that courage is the opposite of cowardice. Cowardice is the opposite of courage. But he points out, and I think he's right about this, that's not at all the right way to think about vices and virtues, the relationship that sustains between them. And in fact, what's going on is that vices don't have opposites, really, because vices are a golden mean or aurum mediocritas, the sort of synthesis or integration of this polarity. So the real opposition lies on the plane of vices. If you want to find the opposite of cowardice, you have to look to recklessness or rashness, something like that. And because courage isn't the opposite of cowardice, because to be courageous, you have to have, obviously not be a coward, but you have to have some fear that you then bring your will to confront that fear and overcome it. Yeah. If you have no fear at all, it just means you haven't understood the situation at stake, or you're just, kind of a maniac. And the same goes for you can conceptualize take any vice, any noble quality that we recognize in a personality. You can perform the same kind of analysis or conceptualization if you grasp that pattern of the virtue not as the opposition, but as the integration of this polarity. Then this famous sculpture by Rudolf Steiner that he calls the Representative of Humanity, it depicts Christ in the center between these two spirits of the devil. One he calls Lucifer, and the other he calls Ahriman. It's some of Steiner's more esoteric teaching, but it's a leitmotif that appears in throughout his whole career. But basically, those are two conflicting impulses towards vice. The way Steiner's theory of the psyche, there are two competing or oppositional impulses towards vice, and what Christ means to Steiner has something to do, among other things, but has something to do with the ability of the human being freely to integrate and sort of repair those two tendencies to fall off the rails. Like you can fall in the ditch to the left or the right, but to keep to the narrow path, you have to exercise some special capacity. So that's sculpture that Steiner was involved in. Painting. Some of his most interesting lectures are about painting and color theory. Goethe was studying a lot of color theory, and he describes this. It's extraordinary. He's talking about how you can create the impression of. So he says, like, a lot of painters tend towards, they're almost like tending into sculpture, into being sculptors. He says the reason is because in painting, you're not dealing with shapes and forms and bodies. You're not dealing with bodies. You're dealing with light and color. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about how he thinks of actually like Renaissance perspective as a kind of indication of decadence in the painting art. And he says why? Because it's relying on this materialization of the purely visual, the purely color-filled, the purely luminescent perspective that is present already in color. And he describes this, and he's not wrong, that the, quote, proverbially warm colors, yellow, orange, red, that those inherent to them is a quality of advancing towards the eye, towards the view. They're coming towards you. Uh-huh. Conversely, the proverbially cold colors, they have a color of receding away. And he says, in Steiner's view, and it's quite interesting, it's maybe worth some of your listeners' time to just, go through a survey of some anthroposophically, that's, by the way, anthroposophy is the name given to Steiner's comprehensive body of teaching. Some anthroposophically inspired painters, and there's an immediately recognizable quality to it. And I don't want to pretend like it's the only approach to painting, but I certainly have found it quite intriguing. And it helps it helps bring to light some of what makes, famous and classic paintings, some of what makes them so effective. And so that's, Steiner's cultural contributions. Theologically, in some ways, he's like a proponent of kind of what you would call like perennialism or syncretism. He's always incorporating many different traditions, hearkening to Buddhism and Hinduism and some like pagan traditions. And at the same time, he also sees Christianity as a kind of like pinnacle to all the ancient religious teachings. He sees Christ as basically, it's kind of like in the same spirit of St. Paul, who says something like, "Ye are the body of Christ and all the members in particular." Mm-hmm. In his letter to the church at Corinth. He sees Christ as something like a kind of the ideal and archetypal spirit of humanity. Sure. That as individuals we can increasingly come to participate. So on the one hand, Christ was incarnated as a particular individual in a particular time and place in history, but in a certain sense is also simultaneously present for us, and it's kind of the challenge for humans to increasingly live into and participate in that, what Steiner sees as like this cosmic spirit of humanity. I'm never going to do it justice. And Steiner, one of Steiner's like principles, or one of the salient features of Steiner's approach is that, and he justifies this. So some people criticize him for being inconsistent and saying things that are contradictory. But it's like, I don't know, what shape is a desk? It's both like a straight line, and then it's a rectangle, and it's a trapezoid. It depends on where you look at it from. And in the same way, and I've always been sympathetic to this defense that Steiner brings up, which is he says, like, the same event appears very differently when it's described from different sides. So I'm sure somebody can find chapter and verse to contradict something that I said, and to be honest, I'm not interested in arguing about it. It's not an argument that I'm going to have with anybody. It's been enough for me, though, enough for me is to try to connect with that sense of what is the evolutionary vector of humanity, of the human self, and to try to align myself with that direction. And again, like Paul says, become a member in the mystical body of Christ. Yeah. That's all I'll say about the theology, because my earliest interest and to this day, probably my foremost interest is in the philosophy. Mm-hmm. But it's not philosophy in the sense that that word is often or ordinarily construed. It's much more philosophy as in the original mandate of philosophy, which was self-knowledge. And so Steiner's contribution to philosophy, more than anything, it's awakening to self-consciousness in thinking, self-consciousness in thought. What that looks like, again, often the best way to try to characterize something is by appealing to something that's familiar. So through analogy, in other words. We all, even if we don't remember, we have this certainty that at a certain time in our lives we performed this operation by which we learned to coordinate, as infants and or toddlers, we learned to coordinate the movement of our limbs. No infant is born knowing how to focus his eyes or, grasp something. You have to learn all those things. To walk, all these are monumental accomplishments that everyone performs. And you do it, it's by dint of effort and trial and error, and it's fits and starts. You don't just snap your fingers and have all that. Again, this is appealing to, kind of like I did with Rolfing, but in the reverse. When I was trying to illustrate what Rolfing means, I went from the kind of mind or soul and then compared it to the body. I'm doing the same thing, but just in reverse. Whatever we accomplished at a certain point in our life in respect to the limbs of the body, coordinating them, learning to employ them with a goal in mind and effectively towards that goal. To my mind, one of the best ways to understand the teaching that Steiner is trying to put forward is how do we set about accomplishing that same task? It's not necessary to do it in respect to our bodies anymore, because you sort of do that naturally as just incorporating into the world, the material world. But how do we member ourselves into the psychological, how do we do this? How do we accomplish the same thing in respect to our mental, psychological, spiritual selves? So this is, again, you have to become aware and self-conscious, awake in a domain of yourself that to begin with you're not. But there's nothing so novel about that at all, because we all did that already once in respect to our nervous system. So that's at least one way of describing, to my mind, what is Steiner's foremost contribution.
Thank you very much. Is there a starting point that people might pick up if they wanted to explore his work?
Well, yeah, it's hard to give a blanket recommendation just because Steiner's work, it does cover such a diverse array of topics. So in a way, a generic recommendation would be like look at a survey of Steiner's works and whatever piques your interest, dive in there, because wherever you dive in, eventually you'll end up in the whole pool. But I really think if a person has the temperament and the patience for it, he couldn't go wrong just starting at the beginning with Steiner, which is with Goethe's, his exegesis of Goethe's scientific method. And there's so many gems in there. This is like early Steiner in his early 20s. But that, I don't want to say he never surpassed that early work, but there's a sort of lucidity and freshness to it that I over and over again have found it profitable and fruitful to return to.
Wonderful. Well,
can I say one last thing about,
of course.
Like culture?
Yeah.
Theology, religion, science, philosophy. Steiner and Barfield, on more than a few occasions, Barfield points out that applying those words to a time more than a couple centuries before our own time is, strictly speaking, anachronistic. Like, people before a certain time didn't divide learning or knowledge or wisdom. They didn't divide life into all these partitions that are, perfectly familiar to us today. Barfield's word for it is actually logomorphism. So he describes logomorphism, which is back projecting or retrojecting contemporary mental structures onto a past time in which people didn't occupy those same mental structures. Steiner, one of the appeals to me of Steiner was this quality of this integral and holistic quality, where he also, it's like he's seeing from a higher vantage and seeing how all these domains, they're actually not separate things. They're one thing seen in many different ways.
That's a great reminder for how often we participate in that logomorphism, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's Barfield's term for it.
Yeah. Well, we'll turn, if it's okay, to Mr. Barfield himself. And I've just got a few questions on him. And thank you again, Max. I learned so much just in this first hour together. So I'll have plenty of thoughts percolating for the next few weeks, but just from our little chat.
Yeah, well, no, I really appreciate your questions, Derek. They're all very on point, and I appreciate everything you've added parenthetically.
Oh, thanks. First thing I would love to know is what kind of impression did you receive? Maybe that's not the right word. Especially, it's always like talking about Barfield because of the way he talks about words. I'm always like a little nervous about how I phrase questions. But anyway, what is it about Barfield's thoughts and writing that stand out?
Yeah, well, you really put a finger on the first thing that I appreciated about Barfield is I had plotted through this really, abstruse and ponderous language from Steiner and then his English translators. And when I stumbled upon Barfield, it was just like clarity and light. And he does have a real extraordinary sense for language in a poetic sense, sensibility for it, and an ability, like a real eloquence to his way of communicating. So that's really and that's something that's never ceased to delight me about Barfield is he really does have this exquisite sense for the quality of words. So that's something I think he outshines Steiner in. Steiner, it's like Steiner's like drinking from the fire hose, and he was just like trying to pour out as much content as possible. Barfield's much more polished, refined. I think, Barfieldians might find this blasphemous, but I don't think Barfield had nearly as much to say as Steiner in terms of total content and diversity of interest. But I do think that within the comparatively defined and narrow field that Barfield emphasized, I think he said I don't think he said anything substantially different than Steiner, but I think he said the same things that Steiner did, but in a much more eloquent and clearer way, especially for English speakers. But I don't doubt that if you translate into German, you would have the same experience. So that's foremost what impressed me about Barfield's thought, was his ability to take these subjects that are in a way familiar, but in a way also, it's talking about things that are, I used this distinction before already once, but it's not so much talking about totally different things, but talking about the same things in a totally different way, so talking differently. And Barfield has this amazing, but it's hard, if anyone attempts, it's hard to retain the kind of precision that you and I already talked about. It's hard to retain that when you're dealing with subjects that are inherently kind of, elusive and amorphous. And Barfield, I think he's really exceptionally skilled in his ability to do that.
Yeah, sorry, when you were talking, I'm imagining their personalities, their dispositions being revealed in their language, and even in their photos. When I look online at Steiner, seems very intense, foreboding, intimidating, just force of nature, and Barfield's this sort of dignified, refined, British gentleman. Anyway, just.
I think that's right. One thing I find the same thing about Steiner, but I agree with you. There's a kind of intensity that can be a little bit off-putting with Steiner. It doesn't bother me, but I can sympathize with somebody who's repelled by it. Barfield comes across as somebody who is just very likable and earnest, but also earnest in the sense, also not willing to entertain bullshit, frankly.
Yes.
So that's an endearing quality about Barfield that I agree with you. It does come across in his writing.
Yeah. Well, speaking of his writings, Saving the Appearances is a book that's frequently mentioned, at the top of the list. I've not yet read it, so I'd love for you to tell me why it's significant.
Yeah. So the subtitle of Saving the Appearances is, quote, "A Study in Idolatry." And I'd like to try to unpack the significance of that term as a subtitle of Saving the Appearances, and we should also talk about what Saving the Appearances means. But before I say that, I should just make a blanket statement that I think Barfield even described it this way, or if not, one of his critics or exponents did. They described, or Saving the Appearances has been described as Barfield's Summa. So it's like the kind of summary of his most developed, mature thought in terms of what the Saving the Appearances does is contextualizes his earlier work, specifically in respect to language and the development of language. It contextualizes it into this much more comprehensive arc of not just the evolution of language, but the evolution of human consciousness as expressed in language. Saving the Appearances, it's hearkening back to an ancient phrase. I used to know who was the first person to have said this, or the first attested use of this word, one of the early Greek or Ptolemaic astronomers. But Saving the Appearances basically means, it harkens back actually to Plato's Timaeus, where he describes what is about to ensue, the imaginative cosmology that he's going to lay out. He describes it as, this is kind of parenthetical, but I've always found it such an annoying translation. In English, you always read this Greek term, you always read it translated as, quote, "a likely story." Unquote. So what follows is a quote likely. Okay, but the words that Plato actually used are ikota, mython. And ikota is the same root as icon. Mython is the same root as myth. So to my mind, a much more felicitous translation is, quote, iconic myth.
It's a big difference.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. That's partly why I find the standard, standard industry standard translation so annoying. But just to return to what Plato's doing, or that phrase specifically, the iconic myth or likely story. Think about the history of, first it was called natural philosophy and later natural science. It's taking phenomena and coming up with explanations for them that, quote, save the appearances. What does save the appearances mean? It means that something kind of self-evident, but if you have an explanation for something, the explanation for that thing has to account for all the observable facts. And if you have an explanation or a theory that doesn't account for the observable facts, it's a problem with the theory. So you need to go back to the drawing board. The situation, of course, is much more complicated, as anyone who has studied the philosophy of science will immediately say. But that's, I think, sufficient to establish what saving the appearances means. It means finding a way to explain observable phenomena. But just consider that when you explain observable phenomena, the explanation is something that you, in a way, add to the phenomena. It's not something that's immediately self-evident to you. So in many cases, a given phenomenon is actually underdetermined. Actually, in virtually every case, there's no exception to this. Every phenomena that you perceive with your senses is undetermined. underdetermined, and there are more than a few ways to, quote, save the appearances to explain it. Stock example is gravitation. So there's the traditional kind of Ptolemaic view about gravitation, which is like gravitation just means heaviness, and the Earth is conceived as the center of the universe, and everything falls towards the center, and why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't something fall if it was heavy? Then you have the Newtonian view, which conceptualizes gravity, again, falling bodies. But the Newtonian view has this extraordinary expansion of its scope to create, to envision gravity as a universal field operating indiscriminately on all massive bodies throughout the whole cosmos. But so gravitation is now not just thought of as like the natural, because the idea is like heavy objects, it's like a realization of their Aristotelian potential that they would fall. They're becoming more akin, they're realizing their nature by falling closer towards the center of heaviness.
Interesting.
That's like a teleological view about gravity. And it was just, people didn't even really think about it. It was just sort of taken as some tacit understanding of why heavy things fall and fire and light rises. Newton came and started to conceptualize gravity as this sort of like external force field operating on phenomena. So it's no longer inherent to a heavy thing that it falls. It's rather because it's being acted upon by an external force. And then you have, of course, like the third iteration of gravitation as curvature in space-time that, comes along with the Einsteinian revolution. So those are all different ways of saving the appearances of the self-evident fact that massive bodies, incline towards one another. So saving the appearances, again, it means accounting for phenomena. Accounting for appearance. Phenomenon just means appearance in Greek. Idolatry, this is the subtitle. So Barfield's argument, he doesn't make it in these terms, but I'm going to, because I think he would sign off on this, especially in earnest since the scientific revolution. And we'll have to get into this more under the rubric of participation, because these are key theories and terms and ideas in saving the appearances, particularly, is Barfield's theory of participation. But in earnest, since the scientific revolution, people, and science has been the vanguard of this, have been starting to almost fabricate or invent a world that is, I don't want to say it's false or illusory necessarily, but it's kind of that way, in the same way that a shadow is like it's illusory, it's comparatively illusory compared to the body that's casting it. Well, imagine the way we conceptualize three-dimensional space, that's like length, width, and breadth. But there's a lot that goes on in life that is not adequately accounted for in the three dimensions of space. And one way I've thought of conceptualizing this is to think about the three dimensions, to think about the grammatical, the modes or the, quote, dimensions that the grammatical persons in language denote. So you have first person, second person, third person. So first person experience, second person relationality, and then third person, this is more or less like the three-dimensional still world of space. So specifically in reference to the second person and the first person. These are real dimensions of life. Relationship is a real thing. First person experience, consciousness is a real thing. And it's not accounted for in the strictly third person scientific conceit of, mass and energy. And also just consider that when we, so imagine you and I having this conversation. We're having this conversation as, from a first person perspective, and then also as a sort of second person perspective, because I recognize you as a you, which is to say, another locus of first-person perspective. But there's another way of conceptualizing and you're doing that vice versa to me, I presume. But there's another way of conceptualizing people, which is as in the third-person perspective, which is like he's a he. You can do this with objects and all phenomena as like a it. Now, notice that's what we ascribe primary reality to in the scientific conceit, is the third-person perspective. And in fact, people think of first-person, the scientific method basically tries to bracket out first person and second person perspective from its inquiry.
Yeah.
And there's obvious utility to that, and it would be almost be nonsense to contradict it. But it risks actually papering over these extremely important, if not, primary dimensions of existence, and so just consider, like when we form that third person model about the world around us, we're starting from our first person experience, and we're then forming second-person relations with these objects, but then we create this third-person representation of those objects. So there's like first-person consciousness, second-person presence of these phenomena and people and objects and beings, and then third-person representation of them. But then just notice that we turn the thing on its head and pretend that the third-person representation that we formed is actually the cause of the second and the first person. And scientists are always trying to do this with like brain, neuroscience trying to produce consciousness from gray matter.
Yeah.
So the last thing to arrive, actually, experientially and phenomenologically and epistemologically, is actually awarded this sort of priority, ontological priority. And so Barfield, I think, would argue that this whole third person representation of existence and reality in the world, it's idolatry unless you trace it back to its second and third person origin. It's the last to arrive, and it's a kind of shadow that follows on the coattails of the first two things. But you can, again, science is proof of this. Like, with great utility, you can treat people and objects and phenomena and, natural resources and nature and all kinds. You can treat them as though they're just standing reserve, to use Heidegger's term. You can do that, but it's wrong to think that you're actually relating to the reality and ground and fundament of existence when you do that. You're instrumentalizing things that have their own being. So in a way, the only world that really exists is that ultimately exists is the first and second person reality. Right. And then the third person is a representation we form from on the basis of those first and second person. And Barfield doesn't articulate his views or theories in that way, but again, I do think he would sign off on it. But then you see where the idea of idolatry comes in. Idolatry comes when we take those representations, the third person, the last to arrive, we take those and we present them as though they pre-existed, the experience from which we actually derive them. That's what he means by idolatry.
That's perfect. Man, Max, that makes so much sense, and a natural segue to my next question. And that is, I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, this inverse order, or at least inverse hierarchy we've created via the scientific method, is an artificial disconnect that Barfield might... as I've read some of his work, he keeps emphasizing the difference between the perception and primitive and modern constructs. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but I'm curious in particular, with all of these ideas, and to your point, as a Rolfer, how it seems to me, and maybe I'm incorrect, but it seems to me that the work that you're doing, that we're undertaking, is an attempt to reintegrate these orders that are out of order. Is that accurate?
No, I think that's right to say. And you're also asking like what Barfield recommends in a way, like as a prescription. Yeah, it's interesting, especially compared to Steiner. Barfield is pretty short on specifics. And he's content basically to present like sweeping characterizations of the evolution of consciousness over history. But yeah, it's notoriously kind of vague on what then people need to do. Steiner never shies away from that. He has all kinds of exercises in thought and meditations that he recommends people do. For my, to speak kind of anecdotally or for my own approach, I really felt at first like a real injunction to try to understand and be able to conceptualize exactly, I don't even want to say what's gone wrong, but, really understand where we're starting from to then understand, like actually diagnose the condition accurately before you try to remedy it. And that was a lot of my academic and intellectual and philosophical work was trying to understand these kind of concepts that Barfield and Steiner were bringing up. But if I'm honest, I haven't, it's been almost a year since I've really felt. This is actually probably, the process has probably been going on for longer than this, but over most of the last year, I used to routinely produce essays on this Substack, or before that it was WordPress site, around these topics. Yeah. I have, half a dozen at least articles about Barfield. But since it's been almost a year now, I've just been writing sonnets. And I've
read some of your translations of Steiner as well. So anyway, please continue.
Yeah, well, no, I don't need to say anything more about that, other than one of the reasons I do that is because I actually feel it's hard to describe, because everything that you work on, everything that you do, every way that you invest your energy and your efforts, often you're producing some effect or some product in the world, and that's obvious, and that's usually the motivation people have to invest their efforts in something. What a lot of people don't consider, though, is that everything you work on is also working back on you and transforming you in a certain way. And so I really found this, aside from the obvious effects that writing almost a sonnet every day would have on your sense for language and your sense for metaphor, it really has this like concrete and tangible effect of stitching together the so-called inner world and the so-called outer world. And it's hard to describe, but when you say, I think it was T.S. Eliot who came up with the phrase objective correlative, but there's like certain external phenomena that are objectively correlated with internal states. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to say this other than that if you're working with the metaphors and the similes and the language for long enough, it starts to become self-evident to you the sunrise doesn't just appear to evoke certain emotions. It really does, and it's objectively correlated with them. So it really seems to have the effect of repairing this drift that a lot of people experience, because that's one of Barfield's substantial portion of Saving the Appearances is dedicated to his articulation of this theory of the evolution of consciousness that he has. And he conveniently divides the evolution of consciousness into 3 epochs or stages. And he calls the first one original participation. And this is like harkening back to early primitive humans. And his way of characterizing it, again, actually, he doesn't say this, but I really do believe he would sign off on this. If you consider especially birds and lynx and deer, they, a couple things, they can live like a swallow can live really well as a swallow by following its natural instincts. Mm-hmm. And it can live really well as a swallow doing that. And it's not living in a way that's deliberative. It's not living in a self-reflective way. It has biological life, but not biographical life. It's not telling its own story as it lives. So that's the way to think about original participation, which is that it's like impulses and drives and instincts that don't actually come from you, but come through you, are guiding your actions. And so again, Barfield describes that as, quote, original participation. So participation has to do with a being's relationship to the wisdom of nature, for lack of a better word. Barfield describes the second epoch in this historical sweep as onlooker consciousness in some places, or modern consciousness. And that is where you get the subject-object rift. And these things that are really, they're really a kind of polarity. Like our attention can oscillate between the subjective and the objective pole, but they begin to appear like a disjunction, as though there's like this self-enclosed inner world and then the outer world, and they never the twain shall meet, and they don't have anything in common. Again, I've really found that working with poetic language, it actually resolves that rift for me, but that's a side note. That characterizes the second epoch. And this is, I think, we don't even give this a name usually, because we just take it as self-evident. It's like the fish in the water. We don't think about it. And we just, in fact, Barfield argues that we are kind of habitually guilty of what he called logomorphism, back projecting the same, inner-outer divide, subject-object divide, back projecting that or retrojecting that onto prior epochs in which humans didn't experience that at all. And then he describes this sort of age to come, which he calls final participation. And that's basically the state in which human beings have reconciled this, antithesis or this division, this rift between the inner and the outer. They've reconciled it, but they haven't just merged into the ocean like a drop. Instead, they're in a way actively, imagine if you, a lot of people are, I'm sure there's a word for this, but people are maybe tempted to make friends with chatbots or AI bots or something. Uh-huh. But everyone with a healthy emotional sense realizes that there's something missing from the chatbot, because it can't actually contradict you, or it's programmed to gratify you. Whereas if a human said those same words, it would be it would appear to be the same thing, but it wouldn't be the same thing at all. And that's maybe a little bit of a clumsy analogy, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that final participation, it's a reincorporation of the human into the economy of creation, but it's not just a return to the original state. It's rather the human being re-enters into the economy of creation, but retains the self-consciousness. And so suddenly then human beings become collaborators in the ongoing process of creation, rather than just, kind of unconscious participants in it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, you mentioned Sonnet's poetic work. I would wholeheartedly agree. I dabble in poetry myself and fiction, and I have found some of the most nurturing and healing, truly spiritual experiences in my life being just a line from a poem it's like transcendent. I don't, that words fail me, but that's been my experience as well. And I wonder, with respect to Barfield, because there is this powerful pull upon us always to nostalgia, and you mentioned earlier the idea of sort of going back, it's a romanticized notion of the primitive days. I tend to joke with people, well, sure, if you wanted to, die of tuberculosis in your teens, go for it, whatever. My whole point being there's quite a bit of benefit, at least with respect to the material world, that has come about through the scientific method. And I'm curious, again, with Barfield, just to maybe put a bow on this thought, is your perception through Barfield, and I also welcome your opinion independent of Barfield, of the final state of being an embodied creative expression, but dovetailed within the network of creation in such a way that we don't abandon the progress in the material domain, but somehow find a harmony and a stasis within the whole construct.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right about the tendency to romanticize the past, and people romanticize the future too.
Yes.
And people maybe, depending on your temperament, you will be more or less inclined to do one or the other.
I'm the future romanticist. I plead guilty.
That's kind of funny. So are you generally left-wing in politics?
No, not particularly.
Because I actually think those two things, they're kind of predictive of one another. As a rule, conservatives romanticize the past and liberals romanticize the future.
Yeah. So well, to be personal, I grew up in a very staunchly conservative culture, and one that perhaps is even repressive, right? There were a lot of things that were taboo, and that manifested its own issues in my life. But I don't know what the turning point was, because probably 15 years ago I would have been pretty anachronistic. In fact, you can see behind me I've got an old rotary phone, just as a tribute to former days.
Kids won't even know what that is.
No. I pull it out sometime when young people are over and just have them figure out how it functions. But you barely know what it is. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But I guess my point is, I'm just imbued with a tremendous hopefulness. And maybe that's through being so immersed in these ideas. It's also definitely tied to my faith, my own theology. I can't perceive of a world if there is a divine creator in which things aren't all restored. We all have this. Mm-hmm. I think Lewis would say that the indication that there's more is that we all feel like something's gone wrong. So anyway, to answer your question, I feel like the integration of technology and other aspect, and it's so frustrating to have to bifurcate, as you describe. In our modern context, everything is put in a category instead of just wisdom generally. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of ambivalent, or ambivalent. I can really connect with what you said about this, kind of imponderable, intangible hopefulness about the future. And I really do feel, I was going to try to look up this line from Thomas Traherne, Centuries of Meditations. Where does he say it? Yeah, we love, we know not what, and therefore everything allures us. As iron at a distance is drawn by the lodestone, there being some invisible communications between them, so is there in us a world of love to somewhat, though we know not what, in the world that should be. There are invisible ways of conveyance, by which some great thing doth touch our souls, by which we tend to it. Do you not feel yourself drawn by the expectation and desire of some great thing?
Yes.
So I recorded that when I read it because it really spoke to me. But I do have this, I'm sympathetic to people that look back on the golden age. What I really think is happening in both cases is it's the same way you can depict, and people started doing this in the Renaissance, or you could depict a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional plane. I really think whenever we're talking about these, romanticization of the past or the future, what's really happening is we are projecting or casting an ideal that is neither in the past nor the future, but is in eternity or outside of time. Mm-hmm. And we are casting that or projecting that onto the plane of the past or the plane of the future. And I really think of it as, there's like a horizontal dimension of linear time, but then there's a vertical dimension. That's where the ideals exist or subsist, and they cast their shadows onto the plane of time. And in the future, it's really a question of to what extent are you living in or embodying these different ideals, like faith, hope, and love, and wisdom, and so on. And if that's in the future, then that's because in the future it's like you've scaled up off of the flatland of time. And so I really feel those ideals are kind of always available to us or omnipresent, whatever time it is. And because in a way, it's the same kind of problem that we have with the first person, second person, third person conceit. In a way, there is no time other than now, which now, the other way to say that is now doesn't have a duration. And so in other words, when we think about time, what we're really doing is imposing a kind of conceptual structure or lattice work onto the substance of eternity. And so, again, these things are always there for us, and the question is whether or not we can be there for them.
Yeah. So slippery.
It is, but in a way, once you start, it's like you have to return to something. I think it's Marcus Aurelius presents this metaphor of dyeing cloth. You have to dye it and then rinse it and then dye it again and then rinse it. And eventually the color, penetrates deeply into the fabric. And I really felt, with Barfield, for instance, and with Steiner, there's no way to just take it in all in a single gulp. You have to continually return to the well. And then at some point you look back and you realize, like, I've internalized this.
Yes. Yeah. That's really good. Well, Max, I've had a blast. Is there any final thoughts on Barfield's life and significance, as well as what that might mean for the future?
Well, this was 3 years ago, I co-wrote a book on Barfield with my colleague Landon Loftin, and we made the argument in the introduction that Barfield.
Landon's going to be on the series with us. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, great! Yeah, no, I'm sure he'll have I'm sure he'll have a lot more at least as much to contribute, if not a lot more than I've been able to. But I did my best. We made the argument that Barfield, he's a thinker whose time hasn't yet come. He's like still, but we have the impression that it's like Barfield's star is on the ascendant, I think is the metaphor we used. And I really do believe that. And that means, Barfield's like, he's like the John the Baptist figure towards Rudolf Steiner. And so, so if I'm right about the first thing and we believe Barfield, then the second thing can be expected too. Barfield, though, you need that kind of figure because, again, Steiner is so inaccessible to most people. And Barfield, like, you get the impression with Steiner, it's almost, he's so unique and sui generis that he's like a meteor from space. Yeah. And you there's a great quote from I think it's from like Confucius, Analects maybe. It's something like, sages are the universe that can speak. And Barfield describes this about Steiner, that sometimes you get the impression that he's not even thinking of this stuff. It's coming through him from somewhere. Mm-hmm. Barfield, though, at least to me, I look at Barfield and I see somebody of, like, we talked about this, uncommon, eloquent sensibility for language, poetic sense, and also, like, sincerity in his thought, earnestness, and just, like, acumen, I guess, in his thought as well. But you get the feeling that he's a mere mortal, like the rest of us. And I think that, at least to me, is a really appealing feature about Barfield, is that you get the feeling that it would be, howbeit it would be an uncommon application of effort and dedication, but you could, through dint of effort, you could raise yourself to the same ridgeline of understanding that Barfield accomplished. And so that's inspiring to think that you could do that. And then, of course, I think Barfield would be the first to say that when you crest that ridgeline, then you see Steiner off on some distant peak. And you think, like, okay, well, that's my trajectory. But yeah, I've, from the first moment I think I did read Saving the Appearances first. I really felt a special kind of affinity for Barfield. He felt like a kindred spirit to me. So I've appreciated the opportunities I've had to share some of my thoughts around his work, and so special thanks to you, Derek, for having me on for this discussion.
Oh, thanks a bunch, man. It's a joy. Something like yourself, perhaps. I don't know. I don't want to praise myself falsely, but I have always been drawn to the more obscure, esoteric, before their time figures. And so your statement there gives me some reassurance that perhaps there is something to this Barfield after all that deserves more scrutiny.
Yeah, well, I imagine, especially if you're talking to a number of people, Barfield scholars and enthusiasts, I'm sure you'll have more than a few recommendations about how to get a start.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, likewise.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word whimsical. H-I-M-S-I-C-A-L, whimsical. It means unusual in a playful or amusing way, not serious. If you know anything about me, you know whimsical is one of my favorite ways to be. And I am thrilled. I couldn't be more blessed to have whimsical as today's sponsor. A little bit about whimsical. The word comes from the word whim-wham. Yeah, that's right, whim-wham, which was used in the early 16th century to describe a trinket or ornamental object. Can't you just hear the old folks saying, look at those young people over there with their trinkets. They're into all that whim-wham. Nonsense. stuff that isn't really what matters. Whim wham. It also makes me think of the movie Office Space and Jennifer Aniston's character with the lack of flair that she's willing to bedazzle her outfit with, as is customary in the service of the patrons. Her boss is disappointed in her because she refuses to wear the flair. You know what that is. It's all the little buttons and gadgets and gizmos. I mean, I feel like Ariel would have loved to have worked in that role. Maybe we could do a mashup where the Little Mermaid works at TGI Fridays in an alternate telling of Office Space. And another word for that is whim wham. So if you've got a friend who has a car with lots of bumper stickers, tell them you like their whim wham. If you know somebody out there who just can't stop collecting refrigerator magnets or coffee mugs or an inordinate number of things, it's really endless, the human capacity to acquire trinkets. But you know what? They're good people. Them's good people right there, because they're whimsical. They're demonstrating that they have joined the land of whimsy. So anyway, that's where whimsical comes from. And I don't know, but I feel like it might be time to let out your inner whimsical. Today might just be that day. So I'm grateful to whimsical. I'm grateful to you for listening at this point in this episode, because it's long over, but you're whimsical enough to stay to the end. So thank you, and thanks to Whimsical for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.